there is an image that most Americans carry somewhere in the back of their minds. A hilltop, a man in buckskin standing at the center of it, soldiers falling around him, warriors closing in from every direction, the last cartridge fired, the last man standing. It is one of the most reproduced paintings in the history of the American West. It appeared on the walls of saloons and the pages of school books. It was printed on whiskey advertisements and mounted in barber shops from Kansas City to San Francisco. The painting is called Custer's Last Stand, and almost everything about it is wrong. Not wrong in the way that details get blurred by time. Wrong in a deeper way. Wrong because the image asks you to look at one man on one hill on one afternoon, and in doing so, it pulls your eye away from everything that actually made that afternoon possible. The Battle of the Little Bighorn did not begin on June 25, 1876. It began years before, in treaty rooms and gold camps, and on shrinking buffalo ranges, in the slow collapse of promises that were never seriously intended to be kept. What happened on that ridge in the present-day state of Montana was not an isolated moment of drama. It was the end of a very long road, and to understand it, you have to walk that road from the beginning. The Little Bighorn River runs through the high-rolling country of what is now southern Montana. In the summer of 1876, the land around it was still Lakota and northern Cheyenne country in every practical sense. On June 25th and 26th of that year, a column of the 7th U.S. Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode toward a village on that river and found something no officer in that army had prepared himself for. What followed over those 2 days was the most significant military defeat the United States Army had suffered at the hands of Native people in the history of the continent. Custer did not survive it. Most of the men who rode with him did not survive it either. The country that found out about it a week later, on the morning of July 4, 1876, the centennial of American independence, was not ready for what it heard. But here is the question that this documentary is really asking. Not who fired first, or which direction the warriors came from, or exactly how many men fell on that ridge. Those questions matter, and we will get to them. The deeper question is this: how did every assumption the U.S. Army carried into that campaign turn out to be wrong? How did a military institution that had spent a decade waging war on the northern plains, that had resources and rifles and a telegraph line running back to Washington, how did it fail so completely to understand what it was riding toward? The answer lives in the people involved. On one side, George Armstrong Custer, an officer with a reputation built on Civil War cavalry charges and a subsequent record on the plains that was more complicated than his admirers acknowledged. On the other side, a gathering of Lakota bands, Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, drawn together by circumstances that had been building for years. Among the Lakota, 2 names stand above the rest. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa leader, a man whose authority came not from battlefield tactics alone, but from a spiritual and political vision of what his people needed to survive. And Crazy Horse of the Oglala, a war leader whose fighting instincts would prove, in those 2 days in June, to be beyond anything the 7th Cavalry had encountered before. These were not the disorganized, desperate bands that U.S. commanders had described in their dispatches. They were something the Army had spent years telling itself did not exist. The story also runs through a geography that most Americans at the time did not understand, a place called the Black Hills, through a treaty signed at Fort Laramie, through a government expedition that violated that treaty, through gold and the human flood that gold always brings, through reservation boundaries drawn on paper in Washington that meant nothing to men who wanted what was on the other side of them, and through buffalo herds that were disappearing fast enough that people who had lived on the plains for generations could feel the world changing under their feet. The Crow Scouts who rode with Custer knew that country. The Arikara Scouts knew it too. Their own complicated reasons for being on that campaign are part of this story. Nothing here moves in a straight line. Nothing is simple. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. It will take you 4 seconds. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I am always curious where these stories reach, whether it is early morning coffee or a late night drive or something in between. It matters to me to know who is out there, because what comes next is the longer story, the one that started not with a cavalry charge in Montana, but with a piece of paper signed in Wyoming, a set of promises made in good faith by some, and with no faith at all by others, and a stretch of land that 2 very different peoples decided, for very different reasons, they could not afford to lose. Before that piece of paper, there was blood. The years leading up to 1868 on the northern plains had been years of war, not the slow grinding kind of war that builds in the background and only occasionally surfaces, but open, organized, costly conflict. The Bozeman Trail was at the center of it. The trail ran north through the Powder River country of present-day Wyoming, cutting directly through the heart of Lakota and northern Cheyenne hunting grounds on its way to the Montana goldfields. The Army had built forts along it. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith. They were meant to protect immigrant traffic and assert federal presence in that country. What they actually did was sit in the middle of some of the most important buffalo range on the continent and dare the people who depended on that range to do something about it. Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota did something about it. The war that carries his name, Red Cloud's War, ran from roughly 1866 to 1868, and it was, by any honest accounting, one of the few successful campaigns of sustained resistance that any native nation had managed to wage against the United States Army in the 19th century. The most devastating moment came on December 21st, 1866, in a draw near Fort Phil Kearny. Captain William Fetterman led 80 soldiers out of the fort in pursuit of what appeared to be a small raiding party. It was not a small raiding party. It was a decoy, led in part by a young Oglala warrior, who would appear again in this story much later. Every one of Fetterman's 80 men died. The Army had no ready answer for what had happened, and no immediate way to change the outcome if it happened again. 2 years of ambushes, raids, and supply line destruction followed. The forts along the Bozeman Trail became islands. They could not be reinforced without casualties. They could not project power into the surrounding country. By 1868, the United States government had reached a conclusion that it did not want to reach. It could not hold the Powder River country at a price it was willing to pay. Not then, not with those forts, not against that resistance. So it sent commissioners to Fort Laramie. The treaty that came out of those negotiations was signed in the spring and summer of 1868. Different Lakota leaders signed at different times, and some never signed at all. That last point matters, and we will come back to it. But the treaty that emerged contained specific, written promises. The United States recognized a Great Sioux Reservation covering all of what is now the state of South Dakota west of the Missouri River. Within that reservation, the Black Hills were explicitly included, not as a peripheral area, not as a contested zone, but as part of guaranteed Lakota territory. No white person was permitted to settle there. No U.S. citizen was permitted to pass through without Lakota consent. The treaty also designated what it called unceded Indian territory west of the reservation, across the Powder River country into Wyoming and Montana, where Lakota bands who had not settled on the reservation could continue to hunt as long as the buffalo lasted. The Army agreed to abandon the Bozeman Trail forts entirely. Within months of the signing, soldiers walked out of Fort Phil Kearny, and Lakota warriors burned it to the ground. That was not a symbolic gesture. It was a statement about who had won. U.S. officials believed, or told themselves they believed, that the treaty could finally stabilize the northern plains. The thinking ran something like this: The reservation would concentrate Lakota people in a defined space. The federal government would provide annuities, food, and eventually, in the language that appears again and again in these treaties, the tools and education necessary for the transition to farming. The unceded hunting territory would serve as a pressure valve, giving bands who were not ready to settle somewhere to go for a while longer. The Army would no longer need to garrison the Powder River country, and the Bozeman Trail, which had been the trigger for all of this violence, would simply be left to grow over. A managed peace, a boundary on a map that would hold as long as everyone stayed on their side of it. Lakota leaders read the treaty differently. Not all of them, and not uniformly, but a significant number of those who signed understood themselves to be negotiating a protection of homeland, not a concession of independence. The Great Sioux Reservation was not a cage in their reading. It was a recognized territory with a boundary the United States had committed in writing to defend. The Black Hills were not surrendered. They were affirmed. The unceded territory was not a temporary courtesy. It was an acknowledgement that Lakota people had the right to live on those lands, according to their own customs, for as long as they chose. Some historians note that the Lakota word for what happened at Fort Laramie was closer to making peace than to signing away sovereignty, and that the distinction was not a misunderstanding, but a genuine difference in what the two parties believed they were agreeing to. Sitting Bull did not sign the treaty. He was not at Fort Laramie, and he would not have gone if he had been invited. He and the Hunkpapa bands he represented, along with other leaders who held similar positions, regarded any agreement with the United States with deep suspicion, not because they were unwilling to live at peace, but because the pattern by then was clear enough to read. A treaty was made. Settlers came anyway. The Army followed the settlers. The treaty was reinterpreted or simply discarded. What had happened to the Santee Dakota in Minnesota in 1862? What had happened at Sand Creek in Colorado in 1864, when Colonel John Chivington's troops attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village and killed more than 150 people, most of them women and children? Those events were not distant news to people on the northern plains. They were part of a body of evidence that Sitting Bull and others had been accumulating for years. So the treaty existed in two parallel realities from the moment the ink dried. On paper, it was a binding legal document with specific geographic guarantees, signed by representatives of the United States government, ratified by the Senate, and enforceable in theory under federal law. On the ground, it was a document that required political will to enforce, and that political will was already being tested before the signatures had time to fade. The settler population pressing against the edges of the plains was not interested in boundaries. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed the following year in 1869, was moving people and freight across the continent at a pace that no treaty map had been drawn to handle. Miners, ranchers, hunters, who were by then killing buffalo at an industrial scale, none of them were thinking about what the Fort Laramie Treaty said. Most of them had never read it. And in Washington, the men with the power to enforce it were already calculating whether enforcement was worth the cost. What the United States had signed at Fort Laramie in 1868 was, in a sense, a pause. A moment when the arithmetic of military conflict had made negotiation cheaper than war. When the arithmetic changed, as it always did, the question of what the treaty actually meant would get a different kind of answer. And the thing that would change the arithmetic, more than anything else, was a discovery that had not yet been made, something that lay buried under the granite and pine forests of the Black Hills waiting. The Lakota called them Paha Sapa, the hills that are black. From a distance, riding east across the high plains, they rose out of the grass like something that had been placed there deliberately, dark with pine, lifting above the surrounding prairie in a way that made them visible for 50 miles in clear weather. They were not mountains exactly. They were something more intimate than mountains. A country inside a country. Streams that ran cold and clear in summer. Sheltered valleys where game moved in winter, when the open plains became impossible. Elk, deer, wild turkey, roots and berries in the draws. A place where a band could winter and survive when everything outside was frozen and empty. But that is the practical accounting. And the practical accounting is the smallest part of what the Black Hills were. The Lakota understanding of Paha Sapa was not an understanding that could be separated cleanly into categories the way a government commissioner might separate them. Sacred, strategic, economic, these were not different columns in a ledger. They were the same thing, experienced together, inseparable, the way a river cannot be separated from the valley it runs through. The hills were where certain ceremonies were conducted. They were connected to creation stories that explained where the Lakota people had come from and what their relationship to the world was. Harney Peak, which the Lakota called Hinhan Kaga, the place of the Owlmaker, was a site of vision quests and spiritual significance. The entire geography was not a backdrop to Lakota life. It was woven into it. To ask the Lakota to surrender the Black Hills and remain themselves, whole, coherent, connected to their own past and their own obligations, was not like asking someone to accept a smaller house. It was closer to asking them to agree that the thing at the center of who they were simply no longer existed. The United States government, and the settlers pressing behind it, operated from a different understanding of land entirely. Land in the American legal and commercial tradition of the 19th century was a surface that could be surveyed, divided, titled, bought, and sold. Its value was what could be extracted from it or built upon it. A mountain range was timber and mineral potential. A river was a water source and a trade route. The Black Hills, in this accounting, were acreage. They could be assigned to a reservation, and if something valuable was found under them, they could be reassigned, compensated for at a price determined by the party, with the power to set prices, and opened to development. The idea that a place could be so entangled with the identity and spiritual life of a people that no price could be set on it was not something the American land system had a category for. The Treaty of 1868 had drawn a line on a map. To U.S. officials, that line could, in principle, be redrawn. To the Lakota, Paha Sapa was not a line on a map. It had never been, and there was the matter of movement. The Lakota were not a people who lived in fixed settlements the way the treaty commissioners imagined reservation life would eventually look. They moved. They had always moved. Their seasonal cycle followed the buffalo herds across a territory that covered enormous distances, from the Missouri River breaks in winter to the high plains in summer, through the Powder River country, across the Black Hills foothills. This was not wandering. It was a sophisticated, practiced management of a landscape that required intimate knowledge of where water, grass, and game would be at each point in the year. The buffalo were not simply a food source the way a corn crop is a food source. They were clothing, shelter, tool material, fuel. A people whose entire material life was organized around the buffalo could not simply stop following them and begin planting fields without ceasing. In a meaningful sense, to be who they were, the reservation system, as the United States imagined it in the years after Fort Laramie, assumed this transformation was both possible and inevitable. Lakota bands would settle. They would be taught farming. They would receive annuities in the transition period. They would become, in the language the Indian agents used with a certainty that was not always matched by evidence, civilized. The men in Washington who designed this system were not all cynical. Some of them believed it. But belief and understanding are different things. The system had been designed without much consultation with the people it was designed for, and it had been designed by men who had never followed a buffalo herd in November or understood what it meant to a Lakota family to make winter camp in a sheltered valley of the Black Hills, with meat enough to last until spring. The bands who remained off the reservation, in the unceded Powder River Territory, and in the country around the Black Hills, were not simply stubborn or backward in their refusal to come in, as the agents sometimes described them. They were making a rational calculation. Life on the reservation in the early 1870s was difficult. The promised annuities arrived irregularly. The food supplies were sometimes inadequate, sometimes spoiled. The agents who ran the agencies varied enormously in competence and honesty, and the honest ones were not always the most capable. The buffalo still ran in the unceded territory. A family that could follow them could eat. A family that stayed on the reservation and waited for supplies that might not arrive had fewer options. Sitting Bull and the Hunkpapa bands, along with Northern Cheyenne and some Arapaho, who moved through the same country, were watching what reservation life actually looked like for those who had chosen it, and they were deciding accordingly. Meanwhile, the settler pressure on the edges of that world was not static. The Transcontinental Railroad had cut the great buffalo herds into a northern and southern herd. Commercial hide hunters were working through the southern herd in the early 1870s at a pace that was not sustainable, and that everyone with eyes could see was not sustainable. Army officers understood it. Indian agents understood it. The buffalo were being killed, not because individual families needed them, but because hides had a market price, and there was no law against the killing. When the southern herd collapsed, the hunters would move north. The northern herd, which still ranged through the Powder River country and the country around the Black Hills, was not infinite. The Lakota knew it was not infinite. The question of what happened to people who had organized their entire existence around an animal that was disappearing was not an abstract one. It was the central material question facing every band that had refused the reservation. So, when later the United States government would present offers to purchase the Black Hills, framing it as a straightforward negotiation between a seller and a buyer, the Lakota, who refused those offers, were refusing something much larger than a land sale. They were refusing the premise that the hills could be separated from everything that made their world coherent. They were refusing the idea that a people could be relocated to a smaller and less hospitable corner of the earth and simply begin again as different people with different habits. And they were refusing with a clarity that only grew sharper as the 1870s wore on. The entire sequence of logic that began with a treaty guarantee moved through a declared emergency and ended with the guarantee quietly discarded. The Black Hills had been promised to them in writing. The promise had seemed, in 1868, to be backed by something real. What would happen to that promise would depend on what lay beneath the hills. And in the summer of 1874, the United States Army sent an expedition to find out. The expedition that went in that summer did not begin as a stampede. It began as paperwork, orders, maps, a column of soldiers and wagons, moving with the deliberate pace of something that called itself official. And at the center of it was a man who had already become, in the American imagination, larger than his own body. George Armstrong Custer in 1874 was not an obscure cavalry officer on a distant frontier. He was a nationally known figure, a Civil War cavalry commander who had been a boy general in the newspapers before he was fully a man. He had the long hair, the confidence, the taste for attention. He had a talent for making himself visible. He also had a record that did not fit neatly into a heroic frame. He had been praised for boldness and criticized for recklessness. He had been court-martialed in 1867 for abandoning his command and mistreating deserters, suspended, then brought back when the Army needed him. He had fought on the southern plains in the years after the war and had attached his name to battles that Americans read about as progress and that the people on the other end experienced as catastrophe. Custer carried ambition the way some men carry weather. It went with him, and in 1874, He was in a position where ambition could be fed. His regiment, the 7th Cavalry, was ordered to lead an expedition into the Black Hills. The reason given was reconnaissance. The Army wanted to confirm routes, examine the country, select sites for possible forts, and demonstrate federal presence in a region that was supposed to be quiet on paper and was not quiet in practice. There was also a stated mission to locate a place for an Indian agency in the hills, an idea that assumed, without proving, that the hills might be managed and administered like a county on a map. But the Black Hills were not a blank space. They were not unclaimed. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, they were part of the Great Sioux Reservation. They were treaty-protected land. The United States had promised, in writing, that this territory would be set aside for the Lakota and that no white person would be permitted to settle there without permission. The language was explicit enough that even people who did not care about it could not easily pretend it was vague. So the question is not whether the 1874 expedition violated the spirit of the treaty. The question is how a violation like that became acceptable, and what it meant that it was carried out by the Army itself. Some historians have argued that the expedition was conceived from the start as a wedge, a way to test the treaty by entering the hills in force, measuring the response, and normalizing the idea that federal authority could move where it pleased. Others emphasize that Army officers were also reacting to rumors and pressure they did not control. There had been reports of white prospectors slipping into the hills already, small groups moving quietly along creeks, and there had been fears, some grounded, some inflated, that if the Army did not go in first, uncontrolled civilian intrusion would ignite violence. Both things can be true. Institutions often act from mixed motives, and in 1874, the United States had more than one reason to send soldiers into a place it had promised to keep closed. The expedition was, officially, a military reconnaissance. Unofficially, it was a statement. The treaty line could be crossed. Custer's column was not a small patrol. It was a heavily equipped force: cavalry, infantry, artillery, supply wagons, scouts, and civilian specialists. It carried the tools of surveying and the tools of war at the same time, which is how the United States so often moved into contested spaces in the 19th century. It also carried men whose job was not to fight at all, but to measure, record, and report. Some of the scouts and auxiliaries came from tribes with their own long history in this region. Crow and Arikara scouts served with the Army in these years, men who knew the plains in a way officers from the East never would, and who had their own reasons for aligning with U.S. forces against Lakota power. Their presence is a reminder that what Americans sometimes flatten into a single Indian war was, on the ground, a landscape of nations with competing interests, older rivalries, and calculations made under pressure. The expedition moved into the hills and made camp in valleys the Lakota knew, along streams whose names carried stories that did not appear on Army maps. Soldiers cut timber, forded creeks, and wrote in journals about the beauty of the country. There were moments of tension with Lakota bands, who watched from the edges and sent messages. The United States did not march in blind. It marched into a place that people were already living with, and within, and responsible to. And the most consequential thing that expedition did was not the mapping of routes or the selection of campsites. It was the gold. Gold was not a new rumor in the Black Hills. The idea had circulated for years, the way mineral rumors do, half legend and half business proposition. But rumors do not break treaties. Evidence does. Evidence gives men with money a reason to become certain. During the expedition, reports began to appear that gold had been found in the streams. Small amounts at first, colors in the pan, enough to make a sentence in an officer's report sound like more than a sentence. The expedition included men who knew what to look for, and it returned with statements that could be repeated, exaggerated, and sold. Once that happened, the expedition's meaning changed. It ceased to be merely a military movement. It became an announcement. The details of how the news spread are a story of 19th century America. Doing what it did best, newspapers picked it up. Entrepreneurs repeated it. Men in saloons talked about it as if they had seen it themselves. Prospectors who had been holding back now had justification. The Black Hills were no longer a distant sacred geography on the other side of a treaty clause. They were a potential payday, and the distance between those two understandings of the same place. The Lakota understanding and the American commercial understanding collapsed rapidly. The expedition came home, and the country did what it always did when gold was mentioned. It leaned forward. What followed was not immediate, and it was not orderly. People began slipping into the hills. Some were turned back. Some were not. The army, which had entered the hills in violation of treaty protections, was now placed in the strange position of being asked to enforce the treaty against civilians who were following the trail the army had just blazed, and the civilians could point to the expedition and say, without much fear of contradiction, that the government itself had already opened the door. This is how treaty commitments die in practice, not always with a formal repeal, not always with a dramatic declaration. They die when the promise is treated as flexible, when the protected land is entered temporarily, when exceptions are made for reasons that sound reasonable in the moment, and when the people who were promised protection watch the protection fail and draw the only conclusion available to them. Lakota leaders did not need a legal brief to understand what the 1874 expedition meant. They could see it. An armed column had entered Pahasapa. It had stayed. It had measured. It had left, and it had carried a story out with it. A promise written in 1868 had just been tested against desire in 1874. The test had a result. The result was that the United States could be made to move its own line. That mattered not only in the Black Hills, but in every negotiation that would follow. The credibility of the treaty was not an abstract concept. It was practical. It shaped whether a band leader believed that coming into an agency would lead to security or to confinement. It shaped whether an offer from a commission was heard as a proposal or as a prelude. It shaped whether Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families, who still lived beyond the agencies, believed there was any point in trusting the paper at all. And it mattered in another way, one that would surface later, after the fighting, after the dead had been counted, and the story had been retold until it hardened into legend, because Custer's presence in the Black Hills expedition linked his personal fame to the larger national story that was forming around the hills. He was not the only officer who could have led it, but he was the one whose name carried weight in the newspapers. When the expedition reported success, good routes, manageable terrain, and, above all, gold, Custer's visibility made him part of the narrative of opening, whether he intended that or not. In the years to come, Americans would speak of Little Bighorn as if it rose out of nowhere, a sudden tragedy on a distant river, an isolated defeat. But defeats are rarely isolated. They have roads behind them. One of those roads ran straight through the summer of 1874. Through a treaty promise that was supposed to mean something, through an expedition that entered protected land, with official language on its lips and unspoken consequences behind it. Through the first widely publicized confirmations that gold lay in the streambeds of Pahasapa, and through the figure of George Armstrong Custer himself, a man already half turned into a symbol. Riding at the front of a column that did not merely explore the Black Hills, it changed what everyone believed was allowed to happen there. And once people believed it was allowed, they behaved as if permission no longer mattered. The news did what news of gold always did in America. It moved faster than soldiers. It outran treaties. It traveled by newspaper and rumor, and letters folded into coat pockets. Men read about colors in the creek beds and heard the older language too, the language that turned possibility into certainty. Strike, pay dirt, riches. a place where a poor man could become a man with options. And then they came, not as an army column this time, not under a flag. They came in small parties at first, prospectors moving along water, slipping past the edges of a reservation that existed on paper, and in the Lakota mind as something real and binding. They were trespassers in the plain legal sense of the word. The Fort Laramie Treaty had said no white person would be permitted to settle in the Black Hills without Lakota consent. Not unless he is careful, not unless he is lucky, not unless he gets there first. It was a closed country, but the Black Hills were also no longer a rumor. They were a verified temptation. And in the American system of the 19th century, verified temptation had a habit of becoming policy. The first camps were improvised. A few tents and crude shelters, the kind of place a man tells himself is temporary. Temporary is a word that has done a great deal of work in American expansion. Temporary cabins, temporary trails, temporary mining camps that become towns with newspapers and churches and committees, temporary violations that settle into routine. By late 1874 and into 1875, the stream of intruders thickened. A trickle becomes a trail becomes a road. Some of these men were desperate. Some were organized, financed, backed by Eastern money. They staked claims and wrote letters home as if the land had been waiting for them. They formed mining districts and elected officers, creating little governments inside a place the United States had promised was not theirs. There is a specific kind of arrogance in that, not always loud. Sometimes it looks like ordinary paperwork, a notice posted on a tree, a claim described in careful measurements, as if the act of writing made it legitimate. The federal government, at least on paper, understood the problem. Officials in Washington could read the treaty as clearly as anyone else. The Army could see what was happening. Agents in the field reported it, and for a moment, the United States found itself caught in the position it had created for itself. It had opened the door with an official expedition, and now it was being asked to close it on civilians who believed the door was open, so orders went out. Soldiers were sent to remove trespassers. Miners were rounded up and escorted out of the hills, and then, predictably, they went back in. This was the part that the Lakota and their allies watched with the sharpest attention. Not because they expected the United States to be perfect, but because credibility is a real thing on a frontier, and the government's credibility was failing in public. If the Army could enter the hills, if miners could enter the hills, if forts could be discussed and agency proposed, then what exactly did the treaty protection mean? It meant, increasingly, that enforcement would be attempted and then abandoned when it became inconvenient. Removing a few hundred men from a wilderness is hard. Removing thousands who are determined, armed, and backed by local political pressure is harder. And behind that difficulty sat something else. Something unspoken but obvious. The United States was not only struggling to remove trespassers, it was deciding whether it still wanted to, because the miners were not just miners. They were voters. They were the advance edge of settlement. They were, in the logic of the era, the thing that made land valuable to the nation. When a mining camp appeared, newspapers and territorial officials treated it like proof of destiny. When a town formed, it became a fact on the ground, and facts on the ground have a way of rewriting law. In the East, there were people who still talked about treaty obligations as obligations. There were officials who worried about the precedent. There were even Army officers who did not relish the idea of being used as a tool for land theft that everyone could see happening in real time. But in the West, and in Congress, and in the territorial capitals, the pressure built with a simple argument. The Black Hills were full of Americans now. How could the government deny Americans access to American wealth? It is a revealing sentence. It assumes its conclusion. It treats treaty land as American by definition, and it treats the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho not as nations with rights but as obstacles in the way of development. So U.S. policy began to tilt. It did not always announce itself as a tilt. It was framed as problem solving, as conflict prevention, as the search for a reasonable outcome. The government had promised protection in 1868, but now protection was being redefined. Protection of whom? Protection of treaty rights, or protection of the growing settler economy that had pushed into the treaty zone. By 1875, the answer was becoming visible in the government's actions. If the trespassers could not be kept out, and if influential people no longer truly wanted them kept out, then the next move was to change the paperwork, to make the violation legal after the fact. That is when the United States attempted to buy the Black Hills. This part sometimes gets blurred in popular memory, as if the choice was simply war or peace. But there was a middle step, and it matters. Federal commissioners met with Lakota leaders and tried to negotiate a cession. The language was transactional: money, rations, goods, promises of support, a trade, the hills for compensation. And Lakota leaders rejected the offer. They rejected it, not because they did not understand value, but because they understood a different kind of value. They understood what it meant when a powerful nation broke a promise, and then offered to pay for the thing it had promised not to take. They understood what it meant when the buyer already had men on the property. Sovereignty is a word Americans like to use in the abstract, but this was sovereignty in its most practical form. The Black Hills were inside the Great Sioux Reservation, as defined by treaty. If the United States could buy them under pressure, buy them because miners had already flooded in, then the treaty was not a treaty in any meaningful sense. It was a temporary inconvenience until the next discovery. There was also mistrust, earned mistrust, built from a decade of shifting commitments. The Fort Laramie Treaty had promised that the reservation would be set aside and protected, and yet the boundary had been crossed almost immediately in spirit. And then, in fact, agencies became tools of control. Rations became leverage. Military posts appeared along routes that were supposed to be closed, and every time a promise was explained away, the explanation sounded, to Lakota ears, like another lesson. The paper changes when the United States wants it to change, but the deepest reason was not simply political. It was the land itself. To American commissioners, the hills could be priced. Land was land. It could be appraised by acreage and mineral potential. It could be exchanged like a commodity, especially if it contained gold. The hills were desirable because they were profitable. To the Lakota, Paha Sapa was not a commodity. It was a center of the world, a place with spiritual weight, a place tied to origins and ceremonies and obligations. People do not sell the place where their stories begin, even if they are hungry, even if the buyer offers blankets and cattle and money, even if the buyer promises again that this time the promise will hold. And the rejection mattered for another reason too, because it told U.S. officials something they did not want to hear, that there were limits, that not everything could be acquired with an agreement drafted in Washington and signed under duress at an agency. So the government's frustration hardened into a different posture. If purchase failed, other methods remained: coercion, deadlines, military pressure. The same set of tools the United States had used elsewhere when a treaty became inconvenient. This is where the story begins to feel, to modern ears, almost inevitable. But it did not feel inevitable to the people living it. It felt like a series of choices, each one narrowing the next. Trespassers entered. The government failed to remove them, or removed them and did not keep them out. Settler pressure rose. Newspapers demanded action. Territorial officials demanded action, and the federal government began to speak less like a guardian of treaty boundaries and more like a broker trying to clear title to land it already intended to take. On the Lakota side, the message was equally clear. The United States had tested the treaty in 1874. In 1875, it was normalizing the violation. The Black Hills were being treated as negotiable because miners had made them so. And if the hills could be taken this way, then nothing else promised in 1868 was safe either. This is the point that sits beneath the coming war like bedrock. The War of 1876 did not begin when the first shots were fired on the Rosebud or the Little Bighorn. It began when treaty violation became ordinary, when it became something a nation could do in daylight and then explain as necessity. By the time the government moved toward ultimatums and campaigns, the ground had already shifted. The promise had already been broken, not in a single dramatic act, but in the steady, practical way power breaks promises. By letting the intruders stay, by offering money afterward, by treating refusal as defiance, and by acting as if a sacred place could be converted into a line item. And in that new reality, the Black Hills were no longer simply a protected homeland on a map. They were a test of whether a treaty meant what it said. And both sides, watching the trespassers build their camps, understood what the answer was starting to look like. Once the Black Hills became a test of whether a treaty meant what it said, the reservation itself became a different kind of test. Not a line on a map, but a system, a set of rules, a way of turning a people who had lived by movement into a people who could be counted, watched, and managed. That was the logic behind agencies and reservations across the plains. In the 1860s and 1870s, the language in Washington was often humane on the surface: protection, civilization, farming, peace. But the mechanics were plain enough to anyone who had to live under them. A reservation was a tool of control over movement, over food, over political autonomy. Movement mattered because movement was how Plains nations survived. It was how you followed the seasons, followed the herds, avoided bad weather, avoided enemies, avoided epidemics. Movement was also how power worked. Leaders led by persuasion and reputation, not by police. A camp could move away from a man who lost trust. A band could split. That flexibility was part of the social order. The reservation system tried to replace that with something else: a fixed place, a fixed ration issue, a fixed agent who became, in practice, a gatekeeper between a community and its survival. If you were in the agency, you could be fed. If you were out, you could be treated as hostile. If you wanted ammunition, you might need permission. If you wanted to hunt, you might need permission. If you wanted to travel to another band, or to a relative, or to a ceremony, you might need permission. And permission was never just a piece of paper. It was a message: your life is now conditional. It would be hard enough to accept that system in good times. But the 1870s were not good times on the plains. And the single most important reason was the buffalo. The buffalo herds had been shrinking for years, pressed by hide hunters, by market demand in the east, by railroad access that made mass killing efficient, and by a federal policy environment that did not mourn the loss. Some Army officers and politicians said openly that destroying the buffalo would force the Plains nations onto reservations. Others did not say it, but acted as if it were a useful outcome. When the herds disappeared, the old independence disappeared with them. This is where the story becomes cruel, in a very practical way. Hunger is not an argument you can debate. Hunger makes a treaty negotiation different. Hunger makes choice smaller. A people can resist soldiers for a season. They cannot resist an empty prairie forever. As the buffalo thinned, the pressure on Lakota, northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho communities intensified. Families that had relied on meat, hides, and trade found themselves dependent on agency rations that could be delayed, reduced, corrupted, or used as leverage. When a shipment arrived short, the explanation might be bookkeeping, or theft, or simple neglect. The result was the same: less food, more desperation. And inside that desperation there were differences, important differences, that later American memory often flattens into a single story. There were Lakota who lived at the agencies, sometimes called Reservation Lakota, though even that phrase can mislead. Some had signed at Fort Laramie in 1868 and tried, as best they could, to make the treaty work in a world where the United States held the supply lines. Some had fought earlier and were tired of war. Some were trying to keep their children alive. Some believed cooperation might preserve something: language, kinship, land, through a narrowing future. Some distrusted the agents, but saw no other path that did not end in starvation. There were also Lakota who remained outside the agencies, often called non-reservation or outside bands. Again, the words are too simple for the reality. These were not people who had never negotiated, never signed anything, never talked about peace. Many of them had. They were people who believed, with reason, that agency life meant surrendering not just land but the ability to live as Lakota. It meant accepting a system designed to break the old ways and replace them with dependency. And even among those outside, there were different calculations. Some came in during hard winters and left again when the grass returned. Some hunted far out and tried to avoid contact. Some were willing to talk, but not willing to move. Some were willing to live near an agency, but not under its discipline. In Lakota politics, unity was not a constant. It was something built, argued over, and rebuilt. That is part of what made the coming conflict so complex and so easy for outsiders to misunderstand. Two men became central to the non-reservation resistance, but in different ways. Sitting Bull, Tatanka Iotaki, was a Hunkpapa Lakota leader whose authority did not come from holding an office recognized by the United States. It came from spiritual power, from reputation, from the ability to persuade and to gather people around a vision of what was right and what was dangerous. He had fought for years against encroachment. He distrusted American promises, not as a personality trait, but as a conclusion drawn from experience. He was not, in the later sense of the word, a battlefield commander directing every fight. That is a myth that makes the story easier for Americans to tell because it puts one famous name at the top of a pyramid. The reality on the plains was more distributed. Decisions were made in councils. Leadership shifted with circumstances. War leaders led in war. Spiritual leaders guided, warned, interpreted, and held communities together when the ground shifted under them. Crazy Horse, Tashunka Witko, emerged as one of the most important war leaders among the Oglala and the wider non-reservation coalition. He was known for fighting ability, for courage that other warriors noticed, and for a kind of personal intensity that did not depend on speeches. If Sitting Bull is often described in the language of vision and prophecy, Crazy Horse is often remembered in the language of action. In the years leading up to 1876, both mattered. In different ways, they helped make resistance possible. And it was not only Lakota. The Northern Cheyenne, themselves under immense pressure, also faced the same shrinking world. Agency life threatened their autonomy too. Some Cheyenne leaders sought ways to survive within the new system. Others chose to leave, to hunt, to resist, to join the larger camps beyond the agencies. Arapaho, divided by geography and circumstance, navigated similar choices. No single motive explains all of it, but the forces pushing on them were shared. So why refuse agency life when the buffalo were vanishing and the army was watching as the roots? Because the agency was not simply a place where food was handed out. It was a place where political life could be reorganized by an outsider, where children could be pulled into schools designed to strip language and belief, where religious ceremonies could be discouraged or punished, where a man's ability to feed his family could depend on an agent's opinion of his good behavior, where promises were made in the morning and revised by afternoon. And because there was still, for a time, another option. Not an easy one, not a safe one, but an option that felt, to many, like the last remaining form of dignity. To live beyond the agencies was to accept hardship in exchange for freedom of movement. It was to follow what buffalo remained, to rely on kin networks, to trade when possible, to avoid the forts, to avoid the ration line, and the daily humiliation of being measured and judged. It was also to preserve a way of life for one more season, one more year. long enough for the children to see what it meant to be who they were. There is a tendency in American storytelling to turn that refusal into romance, noble freedom against inevitable progress. But the people making these choices were not characters in a fable. They were parents. They were leaders responsible for other people's lives. And they were looking at a future in which the Black Hills had already been treated as negotiable. Treaties had already been bent by trespass, and peace had started to sound like a word that meant submission. So the camps beyond the agencies grew, not because everyone agreed on a single plan, but because the reservation system made one thing unmistakable. If you came in, you might not be allowed to leave on your own terms again. And the United States, watching those people remain outside federal reach while miners poured into Pahasapa, drew its own conclusion. Refusal was no longer a political statement. It was going to be defined as a crime. That is the doorway into the next phase of the story, when paperwork becomes an ultimatum, and an ultimatum becomes a campaign. In the late months of 1875, the dispute over the Black Hills began to be translated into a different kind of language. Not the language of councils and treaty clauses and arguments about what had been promised. The language of administration, deadlines, compliance, enforcement. The order itself was simple on paper. Federal officials directed that Lakota bands who were not living at the agencies, those still hunting, still moving, still camped beyond the reach of ration issue, were to report in and settle at the agencies by a fixed date, January 31st, 1876. After that date, they would be treated as hostile. That word matters. Hostile sounds like a description of behavior. In practice, it was a category, a switch that could be flipped. It meant the problem was no longer framed as a negotiation over land and treaty rights. It was framed as a refusal to obey an order. And refusal, in the logic of the frontier bureaucracy, could be met with force. It is important to understand what that meant on the ground, because this was not an invitation to talk. It was not a messenger sent out to ask Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse or the Northern Cheyenne leaders what terms might be possible. It was a demand delivered from far away, with a clock attached to it. And almost from the moment it was issued, it was a demand that ignored the realities. It pretended to govern. Look at the calendar first. Late 1875 into early 1876 was winter on the northern plains. That is not a metaphor. That is deep cold, snow, rivers choked with ice, wind that can kill animals standing up. Families were in winter camps. Horses needed forage. People needed shelter. Moving a large camp was not like moving an army column with supply wagons. A village moved with children, elders, dogs, travois, lodges, cooking gear, the sick, the pregnant. It moved at the pace of survival. Then look at distance. Many of the bands being ordered in were not a day's ride from an agency. Some were far up the Powder River country, along the Tongue, in the region that had become a kind of last refuge after years of pressure. Others were moving between hunting grounds, following what buffalo remained. Even if a leader had decided, overnight, that the safest path was to comply, the logistics were punishing. Snow, thin game, exhausted horses, the constant risk of running into enemies or running into the army. And then there was the political reality that Washington rarely understood, or chose not to understand. These were not units under a single command. There was no office where a man could sign a form and bring everyone into line. Lakota and Cheyenne politics were built around persuasion, councils, kinship obligations, personal reputation. A man like Sitting Bull could gather people because they trusted him and because his vision mattered to them. Crazy Horse could draw warriors because his record in fighting mattered, but neither could simply order every band to march to an agency as if they were soldiers in a regiment. Some people did go in. Some bands drifted toward the agencies in the winter because hunger made every other option smaller. Some came in to talk. Some came in and left again when they believed promises were being broken. The line between reservation and non-reservation was not a wall. It was a constantly shifting boundary shaped by weather, buffalo, rations, and trust. But the ultimatum erased that complexity. It treated mobility itself as defiance. The deadline also carried a kind of quiet cynicism, and historians still debate how much of it was ignorance and how much was calculation. Officials in the Indian Bureau and the War Department were not naive about winter travel. Army officers on the plains knew what it took to move men and horses in January. Agents knew how hard it was to bring in a camp even in good weather, even when people wanted to come. So why set January 31st? One explanation is that the deadline was designed to fail, not because every official sat in a room and said so out loud, but because failure solved a problem. If the Black Hills could not be legally taken by negotiation, and if the non-reservation camps remained outside agency control, then turning them into hostiles created a justification for a military solution. It turned a treaty dispute into a policing action, and a policing action into a war. This is how administrative language works when it is backed by soldiers. It takes a political disagreement and relabels it as disorder. It takes a people moving through their own country and makes that movement evidence of criminal intent. It takes refusal, sometimes principled, sometimes practical, sometimes temporary, and converts it into a target list. By the end of 1875, you can see the shift in the way U.S. officials talked about the situation. Earlier, even after the gold rush began, there was still some pretense of bargaining, of purchasing the hills, of finding an agreement that could be presented as voluntary. But as that failed, the tone hardened. The issue became less about what the treaty said, and more about whether federal authority would be obeyed. Enforcement. That was the word behind the word, and enforcement required a mechanism. The January deadline provided it. Once January 31st passed, the men, women, and children in winter camps beyond the agencies could be described in official reports, not as treaty people exercising rights, not as communities resisting an unlawful seizure, but as hostiles who had ignored a lawful order. That shift mattered because it changed what the Army could be asked to do and what the public could be persuaded to accept. Soldiers sent against hostiles were not, in the official story, sent to compel the sale of sacred land. They were sent to restore order, to protect settlers, to bring in renegades, to enforce peace. And peace, in this new definition, meant presence at an agency under federal supervision. The ultimatum did not create resistance. Resistance already existed, built from years of broken promises and shrinking options. What it did was give the United States government a clean narrative, a date, a line. A way to say, we offered terms, they refused, therefore force is justified. It also created an impossible choice for many bands. Come in during winter, possibly starving on the trail, possibly arriving to an agency system that might not feed everyone who arrived, or stay out, keep hunting, keep moving, and be officially declared an enemy. When January 31st, 1876 came and went, the government could claim the matter had moved beyond negotiation. The men in Washington could act as if the treaty problem had become a simple question of compliance, and the Army could begin planning not a conference, not a purchase, not a settlement, a campaign. What followed was not inevitable, in the sense that history is ever truly inevitable. Different decisions could have been made. Different deadlines could have been set. Different priorities could have been chosen. But once the ultimatum was issued in the form it was issued, and once the hostile designation was tied to a winter deadline, the path narrowed, paper became policy. Policy became orders, and orders, on the plains, became columns of cavalry moving out into a cold landscape toward villages that had not agreed to be counted, and were about to be punished for it. Spring came late on the northern plains in 1876. The rivers cracked open, the snow pulled back into the shadows of the coulees, and as the grass returned, so did movement. For the people who had lived all winter outside the agencies, the ultimatum did not end life the way Washington imagined it would. It did something else. It clarified choices. It told families, bands, and leaders that the agencies were no longer simply places to visit for rations or to hear news. They were lines of control. And beyond those lines, in the country the treaty still named as theirs, a different kind of gathering began. This is the part that is hard for modern Americans to picture, because we are used to thinking of power as something that sits in a building, an agency office, a flagpole, a ledger, a man who can sign a paper and make the world change. On the plains, a village could be a capital without walls. As spring warmed, Lakota bands, Hunkpapa, Oglala, Miniconjo, Sans Arc, Brule, Two Kettle, Blackfeet Lakota, moved toward the Powder and the Tongue, toward the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn. Northern Cheyenne came up from their own hard winter and their own pressure at the agencies. A smaller number of Arapaho joined as well, tied by kinship and alliance, and by the same narrowing of options. They did not gather because a single man ordered them to. They gathered because the same forces were pushing on them from every direction. The buffalo were thinning. The agencies were places of hunger, disease, and dependence, places where a ration ticket could be withheld as punishment. Soldiers and agents spoke the language of deadlines. Prospectors and politicians spoke the language of ownership. And in between those languages were families trying to keep their children alive and their lives recognizable. So people moved toward one another, for safety, for ceremony, for strategy, for the plain fact that on the plains you survived better together. A large encampment was not just a cluster of teepees. It was a system, kinship-shaped, where lodges stood and who camped near whom. A man's relatives were his insurance policy and his obligation. If there was meat, it moved along family lines. If there was danger, it moved that way too. A camp had leaders, but it also had aunties and grandfathers, men who were listened to because they had lived long enough to remember the last time the soldiers came, and women who decided what could be spared and what could not. Ceremony shaped the timing. When a sun dance was to be held, people made efforts to be present. That was not an ornament on top of politics. It was part of how decisions were made and confirmed. A village gathered not only because it needed fighters, but because it needed meaning. A people under pressure needed to know what the world still was, and survival shaped everything else. Horses had to be grazed, firewood had to be found, scouts had to be sent out, hunting parties moved and returned. News came in the mouths of visitors. Someone had seen soldiers on the Yellowstone. Someone had talked to a Crow scout who said an army column was moving. Someone had heard that the agencies were tightening down, that more bands were being pressured to stay put, that leaving would be treated as a crime. This is where Sitting Bull stands in the center of the story, but not in the way a Hollywood script would write it. Sitting Bull was not the battlefield commander of everything that happened later. The fighting leadership in 1876 would include men like Crazy Horse among the Oglala and other recognized war leaders among the Cheyenne and Lakota. The village did not move like a regiment. No one man controlled it that way. But Sitting Bull mattered deeply. He was a Hunkpapa Lakota leader with political weight. Yes, the kind that comes from years of resistance and from an ability to persuade. But he was also a spiritual figure whose visions carried authority across band lines. People listened to him, not because he had a badge or a commission, but because they believed he could see what others could not, and because the ceremonies around him anchored the village to something older than the agencies and stronger than an ultimatum. When people came to camp near him in the spring of 1876, they were not just joining a military alliance. They were stepping into an alternative center of gravity, a place where decisions were made in council, where generosity still mattered, where the old ways were still practiced openly, where the government's timetable did not set the rhythm of the days. That is what made the village so threatening to federal authority. It was resistance, yes, but it was also competition. The agencies were supposed to be the only political centers left. The reservation system depended on that. You come in, you are counted, you are issued rations, you are supervised, you are made legible to paper. And if you leave, you are no longer just hungry. You are hostile. A village beyond the agencies was illegible by design. It was mobile. It could grow. It could break apart and reform. It could move 20 miles in a day without sending a notice to anyone. And it could, at the same time, hold ceremonies, settle disputes, arrange marriages, adopt captives, plan hunts, and decide whether to fight. And this is the scale problem that U.S. officers and Indian agents struggled with, and that would echo through the reports that landed on generals' desks. How big was it? That sounds like a simple question. It was not. Scouts might see a portion of the village and report what they saw, and what they saw might be true and still misleading. A man might count lodges from a ridgeline, not realizing that more lodges were hidden in timber along the river bends. A column might find an abandoned camp and assume it represented the whole, not knowing it was only yesterday's stopping place for one segment of a much larger moving community. And the village was not static. It breathed. A Cheyenne party might arrive, and the numbers would swell. A hunting party might be out, and the apparent strength would shrink. Bands might separate for a time, and then reunite. If you were an officer trained to think in fixed positions and supply lines, you would look at that and see confusion. If you were living it, you would call it adaptation. So when word traveled back to the Army about a hostile camp, estimates tended to flatten reality into something manageable. A few hundred lodges, 1,000 warriors at most. Numbers that fit the idea of a policing action. Numbers that could be handled by a regiment moving fast. And those numbers mattered because they shaped decisions before anyone ever saw the Little Bighorn. By early summer, what was forming along those rivers was not a small band of renegades. It was one of the largest gatherings of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne seen in generations, with Arapaho present too, and with a depth of kinship ties that made it more resilient than any single war party. It was a village that could fight, but also a village that could move, disappear, and reappear somewhere else. The Army would go looking for it with imperfect maps, long supply lines, and a confidence built on undercounting. And that is the hinge of the story. Not just that a battle was coming, but that the United States was about to collide with a political center it did not fully recognize, and a force it had not accurately measured. Because when Custer eventually rode toward the Little Bighorn, he would not be riding toward the kind of village the paperwork in Washington imagined. He would be riding toward a village beyond the agencies. A village that had chosen, for that season at least, to live outside the government's counting. And a village that the Army had already, quietly, underestimated. Washington called it a campaign. Many officers on the ground thought of it as a large arrest operation. Find the people who had not come in by the deadline, surround them, and compel surrender. The problem was that on the northern plains, the word surround meant something very different than it did on a map in an office. The plan that took shape in the spring of 1876 was a three-part movement, 3 separate columns entering the wide country between the Yellowstone and the Powder, the Tongue and the Rosebud, the Little Bighorn and the Bighorn Mountains. The names that mattered were Alfred Terry, John Gibbon, and George Crook Terry was in overall command in the Department of Dakota. His column included the 7th Cavalry under George Armstrong Custer, plus infantry and support, moving out from Fort Abraham Lincoln and then along the Yellowstone. Gibbon, coming from the west with a mixed force of infantry and cavalry, moved eastward from the direction of Fort Ellis, Montana, aiming to come down toward the Yellowstone, and then push into the same broad hunting grounds. Crook, the 3rd piece, marched north out of Wyoming Territory, pushing up from Fort Fetterman toward the Powder River country. On paper, it was clean. 3 blades of a pair of shears, closing. If the non-reservation bands were somewhere in the middle, they would be pressured from multiple directions at once. If they ran, they would run into another column. If they tried to scatter, the columns would sweep up fragments. That was the strategic idea. Convergence, not a single chase, but a net. It carried an assumption that would haunt the whole operation. The assumption that Plains resistance could be cornered like an army in a fixed position. That people whose power was movement could be made to stop moving by threatening them from several horizons at once. But the Plains did not cooperate, and neither did the mathematics of distance. Terry's column might be 200 miles from Crook's and still be considered nearby in military correspondence. Gibbon might be a week's march from where Terry thought he was. The Yellowstone and the Tongue and the Rosebud were not lines you could drive along. They were river valleys cut by badlands, timber, steep breaks, and coulees that hid whole camps. In June, the weather could turn without warning. Heat that cracked lips and killed horses. Thunderstorms that turned streams into barriers. Nights cold enough that a man's hands stopped working the way he expected. And then there was the simplest obstacle of all. Communication. There were no radios, no aircraft, no satellite view. Orders moved on paper, carried by riders who could get lost, delayed, turned around by swollen rivers, or intercepted. A message that left Terry on a Tuesday might reach Crook on a Friday, describing a situation that had already changed twice. Even within a single column, the spacing between units could stretch for miles. A mounted regiment might be hours ahead of the wagon train. Infantry might still be back at the last water. The army could move fast, but its supplies could not. And the farther it pushed from posts and depots, the more it became dependent on a fragile chain of mules, wagons, and exhausted animals. This is where intelligence, what officers called information, what scouts called sign, became everything, and also became unreliable, in the way it always does when you want certainty too badly. Officers received reports from agency officials, from traders, from friendly tribes, from soldiers who had seen smoke on the horizon, from ranchers who had found a carcass on a creek bottom. They tried to assemble those reports into a single picture. Where is the village? How big is it? Which way is it moving? How many warriors? How many lodges? But the country produced mirages. A trail could be old and look new after a storm wiped it clean in a strange way. A camp could be abandoned and still warm in one place, while another part of the same village was 20 miles away. A scouting party might see the edge of a gathering and report it honestly. 200 lodges, maybe 3, and not realize they were looking at only one section, only one bend of river, only one portion of a living system that could stretch for miles. The most important people in that fog were the scouts, the U.S. Army did not move blind by choice. It hired eyes. It relied on men who knew how to read a landscape that most officers had only learned to navigate by compass and habit. Crow Scouts and Arikara Scouts served with Terry's forces, and their presence is one of the ironies that sits under this story like bedrock. The Crow and the Arikara had their own histories with the Lakota and Cheyenne. They had lost ground, relatives, hunting territory. They had reasons, political, practical, personal, to align with the Army in 1876. This was not a simple matter of loyalty to the United States. It was a matter of survival in a changed world and of choosing an ally in a fight that had been going on long before Custer ever reached the Plains. They contributed what the Army could not manufacture quickly, a sense for the country and for the people moving through it. They could look at a set of tracks and tell you if the horses were shod or unshod, if the animals were tired, if a herd had been pushed hard, if children were with the group, if travois poles had been dragged across sand. They knew where a village would likely stop for water, where it would avoid, where it could vanish into broken ground. They could sometimes tell the difference between an old camp and a fresh one by small details an officer would step over without seeing. And still, even they could not give the Army what it most wanted, a fixed point, because the village beyond the agencies was not a fort. It was not waiting to be found where it had been last reported. It was moving in response to grass, game, ceremony, and danger. It had its own scouts. It had its own information network. It could learn about an army column from a distance, from a dust plume, from a line of campfires at night, from riders sent out to watch the horizons. The Army's approach did not happen in secret, not for long, so the three-column campaign advanced on a shifting center. Terry expected that if the columns pressed hard enough, the hostiles, as the reports called them, would be forced to choose, fight a pitched battle or come in and submit. That expectation was not unique to Terry. It ran through the entire logic of U.S. Indian policy in those years. Pressure equals compliance. Hunger equals surrender. A show of force equals order. It had worked before, sometimes, against smaller bands in narrower country. But this was not a single band, and this was not narrow country. This was a wide, braided landscape, and a village that had grown large enough to believe it could protect itself. By mid-June, the three blades were in motion. Terry and Gibbon were trying to coordinate along the Yellowstone. Crook was pushing up from the south, already deep in contested ground. Each column carried its own clock, its own shortages, its own confidence, its own misunderstandings. And behind all of it, like a draft under a door, was the same quiet danger the previous section circled: underestimation. Underestimation of how many people were gathered. Underestimation of how quickly they could move. Underestimation of how well they could fight when they were defending not just a war party, but a community. And underestimation of what happens when a plan that looks symmetrical on paper collides with weather, distance, and a human village that refuses to stay where you have drawn it. Custer rode at the sharp end of Terry's blade, the 7th Cavalry out in front of the slower-moving parts of the column, the infantry, and the wagons that could not hurry no matter how much the officers wanted them to. This is one of the quiet facts that matters. The campaign was a net, but the net's fastest strand was a single regiment, and that regiment was being asked to do the work of speed and surprise in a country that punished both. In the days before the Little Bighorn, sign began to thicken. Trails that did not look like a small party, a scatter of pony tracks like a spilled handful of seeds, campsites, ashes, dragged poles, the scouts, Crow and Arikara men who had been reading this country since childhood, looked at the ground and tried to turn it into numbers. How many lodges? How many days ahead? How much dust a herd would throw if it moved all at once? They were not guessing in the way officers sometimes implied. They were translating. But translation is never perfect, and in a military chain of command, translation also becomes argument. Because Custer had his own picture in his head, built from years of frontier campaigning, and from the way the Army's reports talked about hostiles as if they were a single unit with a single habit. He believed the village could be caught. He believed that if the soldiers moved fast enough, the people they were looking for would do what many camps had done before under pressure: break apart and run. That belief was not irrational. It had precedent. Many leaders on the plains had avoided set-piece fights with the Army when they could help it. Villages had scattered in the face of columns before, not because they were weak, but because scattering kept families alive. And the Army, when it wrote its own lessons into manuals and after-action reports, tended to treat that as proof of a permanent pattern. Indians flee. Cavalry presses. The problem is that patterns change when the conditions change. By June of 1876, the conditions had changed. There were more people gathered than many officers were prepared to accept. Lakota bands, Northern Cheyenne, and some Arapaho, a camp formed not just by refusal but by gravity, by kinship, by the hope of staying near buffalo, by the need to be beyond the reach of agency control, and by the political pull of leaders who were not all of one mind but were moving in the same direction. Sitting Bull was a center of that pull, a spiritual and political leader whose influence helped hold the gathering together. But the day-to-day fighting decisions, the moment-by-moment choices, would belong to others too. Men like Crazy Horse, and Cheyenne leaders like Two Moons and Lame White Man, among many. Custer did not see all of that. No one in Terry's column could see all of it. What Custer saw was the clock. He felt time pressing in several ways at once. There was the simple tactical fear that if he waited for Terry and Gibbon to close up, the village would learn. The army was near and slide away into broken country where cavalry could chase for weeks and never catch it. There was also the pressure of coordination. Terry's plan depended on movement like a door closing. If one hinge was slow, the gap stayed open. And then there was ambition, the human kind. The thing officers rarely confess in reports, but everyone understands. Custer had been suspended and restored. He was famous. He was also vulnerable to being blamed if the campaign ended in another long, expensive chase with no decisive result. In that atmosphere, waiting can feel like failure before the first shot is fired. The scouts complicated that feeling. As the 7th moved up, some of the Crow and Arikara scouts began to say the signs were too big. Not simply a camp, a very large camp. They used the language they had. They said the village was like grass, spread out, thick. Some accounts say they tried to tell officers that the trail they were following was the trail of a great many people, that it was not the kind of village that would panic and dissolve at the first alarm, that it could stand and fight. But warnings like that do not land cleanly when they collide with assumptions. An officer can hear large and still translate it back into what he thinks large means. He can hear fear in a scout's voice and assume the scout is exaggerating. He can look at a fast-moving plan and decide that speed itself will shrink the enemy, that surprise will make numbers irrelevant. So Custer closed in. And then he made the decision that would shape everything that followed. He divided the 7th Cavalry. It is easy to treat that choice as madness or as fate, but in cavalry doctrine of the time, dividing a regiment was not automatically absurd. It could look, on paper, like the very thing you did to prevent the outcome everyone feared most, the village scattering. If you believed the camp would run, you wanted to hit it in more than one place, to block escape routes, to keep pressure on multiple edges at once. You also needed to scout your flanks, because an enemy village was not just a point on a map. It was surrounded by riders, by lookouts, by war parties that could strike at your side while you stared forward. So Custer gave Marcus Reno a battalion and directed him toward the valley, toward the river, and the lower end of where the village was thought to be. He sent Frederick Benteen with another battalion to move to the left, to reconnoiter, and to make sure no large force was moving in from that direction, and to keep the regiment from being surprised in the open. And he kept a portion under his own immediate command, moving on a different line, higher ground, a route that could bring him to the village from another angle. 3 separate commands, separated by distance, by terrain, and by minutes that would soon matter like hours. This is the double edge of the decision. If the assumptions were right, if the village was smaller, if it was already preparing to flee, if panic would ripple through it once soldiers appeared, then splitting the regiment could turn speed into control. Multiple threats, multiple pressures, a net thrown quickly. But if the assumptions were wrong, the risks multiplied immediately. Because separated cavalry units cannot support each other quickly in broken country. Because orders carried by messenger can arrive late or not at all. Because a battalion engaged on the valley floor cannot easily see what is happening on the bluffs, and men on the ridges can miss red dust and gunfire echoing off coulees. And because the one thing the scouts were trying to say, without having to say it in the Army's language, was that this village might not run, it might turn. And if it turned, each separated piece of the 7th would have to face not a scattering crowd, but a concentrated response, not a flight, a fight. Reno rode down toward the valley with a set of expectations that came from years of Army habit. You locate the camp. You strike it hard enough to startle it. You turn its movement into collapse. And as families run, as lodges come down, you push the chaos away from you. and toward whatever other command is waiting to catch it. But when the valley opened and the Little Bighorn came into view, the thing that was there did not match the picture the regiment had been carrying. It was not a small wintering camp. It was not a single band with a few lodges tucked into cottonwoods. It was a long, living line stretched along the bends of the river, an encampment that ran and ran, lodge after lodge, smoke, horses, people moving between circles, a village with momentum. A village that, for the people inside it, was not just a place to sleep but a temporary capital, built out of kinship and necessity. Modern National Park Service estimates put that village at around 8,000 people. Not 800, around 8,000. And within that, roughly 500 to 800 warriors, Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters, present in numbers that no officer in the 7th Cavalry could comfortably fit into the usual categories. This was not one tribe, it was not one leader. It was a gathering of many bands, many families, and many men who knew exactly why the army was coming. That scale mattered in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with physics. The U.S. Army's assumptions about hostile villages were built around a pattern. Find them, hit them, they scatter. The pattern had reasons. Scattering saved children. Scattering preserved horses. Scattering could draw soldiers into long chases that exhausted them and broke their supply lines. It had worked before. It would work again in other places. But a very large encampment changes the math. A village of that size does not move like a startled deer. It moves like a herd. And a herd does not simply vanish when it hears a shot. It surges. It bunches. It creates its own storms of dust and noise and decision. The first instinct is still to protect families, to push non-combatants away from the danger, to get the lodges and the children, and the old ones moving toward safety. But, at the same time, because there are so many people, because there are so many horses, because there are so many men of fighting age in one place, the village can also do something smaller camps often could not do quickly. It can answer, if you are a cavalry officer, trained to think in terms of pursuit. The idea you are counting on is delay. You hit the edge of the village. The village spends precious minutes in confusion. Warriors scramble to find weapons, to catch horses, to figure out where the threat is coming from. Those minutes are what cavalry lives on. Minutes are what let scattered companies reunite. Minutes are what let a smaller attacking force control the tempo. But an encampment holding 1,500 to 800 warriors does not need to manufacture time the way a smaller camp does. Somewhere in that long line of lodges, men are already mounted. Somewhere, weapons are already in hand. Somewhere, riders are already out on the edges, watching the world. And when the alarm runs down the river, it does not take long for that alarm to become movement in the opposite direction. Movement toward the shooting. The size of the village also changed morale, not in the abstract sense, but in the most practical way. When people can look left and right and see allies, see other bands, other societies, other relatives, fear does not have as much room to grow. A man who might hesitate if his family were alone on the prairie does not hesitate as much when he knows there are dozens of other lodges behind him and hundreds of other riders coming up. The same concentration that made the village hard to move also made it easier to defend. It could generate a response with a speed that surprised the men who believed they were bringing surprise. And there is another piece that outsiders often miss. A large village is not simply larger. It is more organized in the ways that matter in a crisis. Messages travel fast. Decisions are made in parallel. Women begin moving children and packing without waiting for a single command. Older men and leaders look for the point of danger. Warrior societies form up. Horse herds are shifted. The village becomes, in moments, both an evacuation and a mobilization. Reno could not see all of that at once. No one could. From a distance, you see a strip of lodges and the glint of river and the rise of dust. You see riders, but you cannot count them. You see movement, but you do not know if it is flight or if it is the village turning its face toward you. And the men who rode with Reno had their own expectations filling in the gaps. They had been told they were striking a village that would run. They had been told they were the hammer that would start the breaking. Many of them, seeing the length of that camp, felt something shift inside the plan without having words for it. Because if the village was this big, then the regiment was not cutting off a retreat. It was stepping into the mouth of something. This is where the campaign's earlier pressures. The treaties ignored, the Black Hills taken, the agencies tightened, the buffalo thinning, become more than background. They become the reason so many people were here at once. So many who had decided that the safest place for now was together, beyond the agencies, beyond the lines on paper, in a village large enough to feed itself, to hunt, to move if it had to, and, if the army forced the question, to fight. Reno, at the south end of that long village, was about to force the question, because whatever Custer expected and whatever Terry's plan had assumed, the first direct collision would not happen on the ridges with Custer's own battalion. It would happen down in the valley. It would happen where the village began. It would happen where Reno was. And when Reno struck, he would discover the meaning of that size in the most immediate way possible, in how fast riders appeared, in how quickly the space in front of him filled, and in how suddenly a supposed pursuit became a battle. Reno did not stop. He had been given an order that was simple in its language and complicated in its assumptions. Charge the village, and you will be supported. Somewhere behind him, on the high ground, Custer's other battalions were moving to find their own crossings, to cut off flight, to turn this long camp into a running thing. Reno was the first contact. He was the hand that was supposed to slap the hive. He crossed into the valley with 3 companies, the line of troopers stretched out, horses laboring in the heat, the river to his left, and the cottonwoods ahead. The Crow and Arikara, scouts with the regiment, had seen the village and understood what it meant, and some of them, later, would say they tried to warn the officers what kind of fight this could become. But warnings are thin things once momentum begins. Reno advanced toward the southern end of the encampment, toward the first lodges and the first horse herds, and for a brief moment it looked like the old pattern might still hold. People were moving. Dust was rising. Shapes were running between teepees. The edge of the village, at least, appeared to be reacting like a place surprised. Then Reno slowed his charge and brought his men down from the saddle. It is one of the decisions that has been argued over ever since. Cavalry doctrine said you could fight mounted for shock, but you often fought dismounted for control, using horses as mobile cover and as a way to bring ammunition forward. Reno formed a skirmish line in the valley grass. Troopers spread out, each man holding his space, each 4th man back with the horses. The idea was to lay down fire, to steady the front, to push forward in a measured way and keep the village in motion. But a skirmish line is only strong if time is on your side. It is strong if the enemy is still deciding whether to fight. It is strong if the village is already breaking apart. And in those first minutes, the village was not breaking. It was doing 2 things at once. At the southern end, women began moving children and the old ones away from the river. Lodges were being struck, travois being redded, horses being pushed out of the most exposed ground. That part looked like flight, but it was not the whole reaction, because as families shifted north and deeper into the bends, riders were also coming in the opposite direction. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho men were mounting fast, not as a single wave from a single leader, but as separate groups that formed up with frightening speed. Warrior society men, relatives, young men, eager to prove themselves, older fighters who had seen soldiers before and knew how quickly a skirmish line could become trapped. The first defenders did not need to defeat Reno outright. They only needed to take away his tempo. They began to press his flanks. They used the folds of the ground, the riverbank, the brush. They did what Plains fighters often did when they had room. They rode hard, fired, fell back, came again from another angle, making the line turn its head, making the soldiers fire at movement and dust, making each trooper feel as if the danger was multiplying. And as that pressure grew, the thing Reno had counted on, forward motion, began to stall. A dismounted line in tall grass can feel like an anchor. The village was not a fixed target. It was a living thing behind that line, and now it was a living thing that had teeth. Reno's men could see riders in greater numbers. They could see the space in front of them filling. Some accounts describe the sense that the skirmish line was being wrapped, that the fight was no longer straight ahead but everywhere at once. Reno's position in the valley had one other weakness, one that would matter in the next few minutes. The Little Bighorn Valley is not a flat parade ground. The cottonwoods and the bends create pockets, and once you are dismounted, you are committed to where your horses are held. If the horse holders are driven off, the line becomes a line of men on foot in hostile country. If the horses panic, the line can collapse without being defeated in the clean way officers like to imagine. As more native fighters arrived, that risk turned from theory to reality. Reno's line began to bend back toward the timber along the river. The timber offered cover, and it offered a reference point in the confusion. It also offered something else, a place where units could bunch up, where command could be heard. But bunching up is what rifle fire loves. It is what mounted men circling outside can exploit. Reno gave the order to fall back into the trees, and then, not long after, the decision came that would define his part of the battle. He ordered a retreat, back across the river, out of the valley, toward the bluffs. It is a verified fact that Reno attacked the southern end of the village and was forced into retreat. The argument is not whether it happened. The argument is what forced means in a fight like this. Was he outflanked beyond recovery? Was he overwhelmed by numbers? Did he lose control of his command? Did the shock of the village's size break his confidence? Historians have weighed all of it. What matters on the ground is simpler. The village answered faster than he could manage. The pressure rose too quickly. The position became untenable. The retreat was not a clean withdrawal. It was chaos. Men ran for their horses. Some found them. Some did not. The timber, the riverbank, the tall grass, the shouts and gunfire, everything that had been manageable in a controlled advance became a trap in reverse. Troopers plunged into the Little Bighorn, some crossing in groups, some alone. Some swept into deeper water than they expected. Horses collided. Ammunition was lost. Officers tried to form up men who were no longer in their companies. Native fighters, now fully engaged, pressed hard, riding into the openings, firing from close range, turning a retreat into a rout in places. Losses came quickly, not just killed, but separated, drowned, shot down on the banks, overtaken in the open ground between the river and the bluffs. The survivors clawed their way up the steep rises, breathless, eyes wide, dragging wounded, leaving others where they fell, because stopping meant dying. And in the space of what felt like minutes, the battle's shape changed. Reno's attack had been meant to fix the village in place, to push it north, to create a problem that Custer's other battalions could solve. Instead, the attack acted like an alarm bell that could be heard across the entire encampment. It told every Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho man who was hesitating exactly where the threat was. It drew fighters down to the valley, and then, as Reno broke back to the bluffs, it drew them up and out toward the high ground, where the rest of the regiment was supposed to be maneuvering. This is how the rest of Little Bighorn is set in motion. Not by a single dramatic last stand yet, not by the famous ridge line, but by a failed first strike that instantly stripped away surprise. Reno's repulse did not end the fight. It began the real one. It took the plan that depended on timing and turned timing into the regiment's enemy. And as Reno's men tried to reform on the bluffs, with dust in their mouths and wounded on the ground, the village below was no longer a camp being raided. It was an army waking up, Reno's survivors reached the top in pieces, not as companies, but as clusters of men who had simply made it. They fell into the first shallow folds of ground and tried to breathe. Officers shouted for order and got only partial obedience, because order is a luxury when your heart is still running and your hands are still shaking. Some men lay flat and stared back down toward the river, as if they expected the valley itself to rise up after them. And this is the moment when Frederick Benteen enters the center of the story. Not with a charge, not with a heroic decision made on a ridge, but with a column arriving from somewhere else following orders that had already begun to age. Earlier that day, Custer had sent Benteen with 3 companies to the left to sweep the broken country and make sure no village, no warriors, no hidden threat sat out on the flank. It was a reasonable precaution in the abstract. It was also time slipping away in real life. Benteen moved through ravines and dry channels, found no great body of people, no second village, no enemy waiting in ambush, and turned back toward the sound. Somewhere along that return, he met the messenger, trumpeter John Martin, with a note from Custer. "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." The note is famous because it is so plain, and because it was already too late to be plain. Be quick is not a plan. It is a confession that the plan is leaking. When Benteen rode up onto the bluffs, he did not find Custer. He found Reno. He found broken men. He found wounded piled behind dead horses. He found the stunned quiet that comes after panic, when a group realizes it has survived the fall, but not the consequences. Benteen joined Reno on the bluffs, and the 2 commands, now fused by necessity, began doing the only thing left that could be done. They made a place to stand. The defensive position was not chosen in a conference and laid out like a textbook diagram. It was improvised, shaped by the ground and by fear. The crest lines offered visibility but invited bullets. The shallow draws offered cover but could become traps. Men began digging with cups, with knives, with their hands. They used saddle blankets and tin plates to scrape at the hard soil. They pushed carcasses into low walls. They pulled wounded into the least exposed depressions. Someone found the pack train and its ammunition mules and brought them up, and suddenly, the difference between living through an afternoon and dying in it became a question of cardboard boxes and lead. Down below, the village had fully turned itself into a fighting force, and the fighters were no longer focused only on the valley. Lakota and northern Cheyenne and some Arapaho riders began appearing on the ridges and folds around the hilltops, testing angles, firing from distance, pushing closer when they saw weakness, falling back when they met concentrated volleys. It was not one continuous charge. It was pressure, patient and intelligent, finding the edges of the soldier's position the way water finds a crack. What Benteen brought, beyond his men and his ammunition, was a kind of stubborn steadiness. He was not a man known for warmth, and he was not a man known for reverence toward Custer. But on those bluffs, personal opinions became irrelevant. The hilltop was now the regiment, or what was left of it, Benteen and Reno, along with Captain Thomas Weir, whose impulse to look north would soon become its own small drama, had to decide whether to hold, to move, to search for Custer, or to wait for him to appear. And the problem was that nobody knew where he was. They could hear firing in the distance. Sometimes. They could see dust plumes in the north. Sometimes. Men climbed to the highest points and strained their eyes, trying to read the country like a map written in smoke. Some believed Custer was still maneuvering, that he would hit the village from another direction, and the pressure would suddenly lift. Others feared the opposite, that the heavy firing they could not quite locate was the sound of Custer being swallowed. The uncertainty shaped everything. It made every move feel like a gamble with no information, and it made staying put feel like a moral failure. Weir did push forward to a higher point, what later took his name, trying to see into the northern reaches of the battlefield. But visibility did not equal clarity. What he and others thought they saw, figures, gun smoke, riders moving in masses, did not resolve into an answer they could act on. Native fighters pressed them there too, and the forward group was pulled back into the main perimeter. If Custer needed them, they did not know where to go. If Custer was already gone, leaving the bluffs could mean losing the last defensible ground they had. So they stayed, and they endured. The Reno-Benteen position survived for reasons that were not romantic and not mysterious. It had terrain that could be held with rifles. It had ammunition once the packs arrived. It had a concentrated body of men in a compact perimeter, which meant firepower could be brought to bear on any point that softened. And it had, crucially, a kind of grim agreement among the defenders that whatever had happened in the valley would not be allowed to happen again on the hilltop. They could not run. There was nowhere to run to. For the Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho fighters, the hilltop position was a hard nut. It could be harassed, it could be tightened, it could be made miserable. Men could be picked off when they exposed themselves for water. The wounded could be made to suffer. But storming a dug-in perimeter under sustained rifle fire carried its own cost, and the battle below and to the north had its own demands. And so the hours passed into night, and then into another day. Benteen and Reno and their men remained under siege until June 26, pinned to the bluffs by fire and by the knowledge that the world beyond their shallow trenches belonged, for the moment, to someone else. And all the while, hanging over every decision, like a cloud that would not move, was the one question that neither bullets nor shovels could answer. Where was Custer? North of Reno and Benteen's hilltop, the ground breaks into a series of long spines and shallow coulees that run toward the river like fingers. That is where Custer went. Not into the village, not down into the cottonwoods. He stayed on the high country, moving north with 5 companies, roughly 210 men, trying to find a place where his small wing could strike and not be swallowed. We can trace parts of that movement, but we cannot narrate it the way later Americans wanted to. There are no surviving U.S. accounts from Custer's immediate command. No officer rode away to write a report. No enlisted man from those 5 companies lived to tell what he saw in order. What we have instead are angles, native testimony often given years later, sometimes consistent, sometimes not, the archaeology, cartridge cases, bullets, bones, patterns on the ground that can suggest motion, concentration, and collapse, and the hard fact that when the firing in the north ended, Custer's wing was gone. The likely sequence begins with an attempt to reach the river. Many historians think Custer was looking for a crossing near the north end of the village, a way to pressure the camps, seize non-combatants, or force a panic that would break the village apart. It was the kind of logic U.S. officers had used before. Hit the families, and the fighters will scatter. Make the village run, and the battle becomes pursuit instead of a stand. But the village did not behave like that. It did not fragment. It did not flee in one direction. It turned. As Custer moved along the ridges, Lakota and northern Cheyenne fighters, joined by some Arapaho, were already in motion from the fighting against Reno, from the village itself, and from the edges where scouts and young men watched the bluffs. They did not need to be summoned by a single commander. Momentum did the summoning. The sounds of firing and the sight of soldiers on the heights drew riders the way a wind draws grass into a single lean. There are accounts that Custer's men reached a point where they could see into the valley and toward the river, and then were checked, met by warriors who used the folds of the land the way infantry uses walls. The coulees mattered. A man on a horse could appear, fire, and vanish into a crease. A line of soldiers trying to hold a ridge crest could find that every time it exposed itself, it offered targets to people who were not standing where they could be seen. This is where the terrain and numbers begin to speak to each other. Custer's wing was not large. 5 companies on paper, but spread by the ground, by the need to hold horses, by the confusion of dust and distance. Against them were fighters who were growing in number by the minute, and who had something the soldiers did not, a clear sense of where the village was, where their families were, and what had to be protected. They were not defending an abstract position. They were defending a living place. The evidence suggests Custer did not form a single neat perimeter and wait for a cinematic end. What appears instead is movement and then compression. Small clusters, skirmish lines, short stands made and abandoned, fire from one ridge, then a pullback into the next fold. Horses hit, men dismounted, lines bending, not in parade ground order, but in the way any line bends when it is being tested at multiple points. The warriors exploited that. They did not need to rush a solid wall. They needed to keep the soldiers from settling into one. They pushed along the flanks, used the ravines to get close, used sheer volume of fire to make the ridge tops unsafe. Some accounts speak of fighters working in from the sides and rear, cutting off routes, taking the high points that made the next position untenable. When soldiers tried to move, they were most vulnerable, and Custer's wing, to survive, had to keep moving. At some point, the movement northward becomes a movement with fewer options. The ridge is narrow. The river is there but not reachable in safety. Behind them, more riders. Ahead of them, more riders. This is where U.S. assumptions break in the open. The campaign plan, the 3 columns, the idea that the non-treaty village would run when pressed. Those were beliefs as much as they were strategies. On the ridges, the belief met a reality that was organized differently. This was not a scattered band trying to escape a net. It was a large village choosing to stand and capable, in that moment, of concentrating force faster than the soldiers could. We should be careful even here. The exact order of events, who went to the river and who did not, where Custer was at the final moments, whether any portion tried to break out, cannot be stated with perfect confidence. The ground has been walked and measured, and the artifacts have been counted. But artifacts do not speak in sentences. Native witnesses remembered bursts of action, men falling, horses screaming, the way smoke and dust hit everything. Some remembered Custer in one place, others in another. Some accounts were filtered through translation, through time, through the pressure of being asked the same questions by outsiders who already knew what answer they wanted. What remains widely accepted is the outcome and the scale. Custer's 5 companies, about 210 men, were overwhelmed on those ridges, not in a romantic tableau, not in a storybook circle of heroes, but in a fast-changing fight where the advantage shifted decisively to the people who knew the land, who had the numbers, and who were fighting with the force of an immediate necessity. And when it was over, the firing to the north stopped. On Reno Hill, men listened for it, like men listen for weather. Then they heard something else, the sound of the battle moving away. The sound of riders and shouting and life continuing down in the valley. And the silence where Custer had been. The silence where Custer had been did not mean the fight was over. It meant one part of it had ended. Down in the valley and up on the ridges, Lakota and northern Cheyenne fighters, joined by some Arapaho, had won something that is hard to describe in the language Americans later tried to force onto it. It was a major victory. It was also a defense. A village had been attacked, and it had not broken. It had absorbed the blow, turned outward, and destroyed the force that had come in expecting panic. Within a day, that fact began to travel. Runners went out. Scouts watched the horizon. On Reno Hill, the survivors dug and waited, thirsty, surrounded, and unsure whether the next push would finish them too. And then the village made a decision that tells you as much about the aftermath as it does about the battle. It did not stay to fight the army that would surely come. It began to move. The families had been the center of gravity all along. A victory did not change the basic problem of the campaign. The United States could keep sending men. News moved east faster than any horse. When it hit the newspapers, it landed like a physical blow. In 1876, the United States was celebrating its centennial. The story Americans told themselves that year was a story of progress, railroads, cities, and a frontier that was closing. And then suddenly, on that same frontier, a famous officer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry were gone. The shock was not only grief, it was disbelief. The U.S. Army had fought hard wars since the Civil War ended, but many Americans still assumed the outcome on the plains was settled in advance. That assumption had been reinforced by the reservation system, by the destruction of the southern buffalo herds, by the idea that native resistance was isolated and fading. Little Bighorn contradicted all of it in one afternoon. Some people tried to explain it away immediately. They blamed Custer's pride, or his speed, or his refusal to wait for Terry's larger force. Others blamed the scouts, the terrain, the dust, the heat, the bad luck of a river crossing that did not exist where it was needed. Some of those things mattered. But the deeper explanation was simpler and harder for the American public to accept. A large, well-armed native force had fought with coordination, momentum, and purpose, and for once the U.S. Army had met it at a disadvantage. And that is where the story turns in a way that surprises people who grew up on the legend. In American political life, this kind of defeat often produces one of 2 reactions. Either you bargain or you punish. In 1876, the United States did not move toward a negotiated settlement. It moved toward a tightening noose. The defeat did not make Washington reconsider the ultimatum or the seizure of the Black Hills. It made the military and the public demand results. More troops, harder orders, less patience for talk about treaty rights and hunting grounds. The language changed. The word hostile widened to include anyone still living outside the agencies. And once you were inside that word, you could be pursued not just as a fighter, but as a problem to be solved. The campaigns that followed were not one dramatic chase. They were a season of pressure, columns moving through the river valleys and across the Powder River country. Winter operations designed to do what summer battles rarely could: find people when they could not move fast, take their horses, burn their lodges, destroy their food. It was a strategy of deprivation as much as combat. If you cannot catch the warriors in a clean fight, you make it impossible for the village to remain a village. This pressure fell unevenly, because the native side was not one unified army with one headquarters. There were Hunkpapa and Oglala and Miniconjou and Sans Arc and Brule bands, northern Cheyenne groups with their own leaders, and some Arapaho. There were also native people on the other side of the campaign, Crow and Arikara scouts riding with the army, reading the same ground through a different set of loyalties and losses. The northern plains were not a chessboard with 2 colors. They were a human landscape with old rivalries, old injuries, and new pressures forcing decisions faster than traditions could comfortably hold. By late 1876 and into 1877, the pattern becomes clear. Some groups came in quickly, calculating that survival now meant rations and paperwork, and the suffocating closeness of an agency. Others stayed out through the winter, moving, splitting, rejoining, trying to keep the old freedom alive one more season. But the buffalo were thinning, ammunition was finite, and the army, unlike the village, could replenish itself. Within roughly a year of Little Bighorn, most of the people the government labeled as hostiles had surrendered or been compelled back to the agencies. Some leaders held out longer. Some fled north into Canada for a time. Some returned and surrendered later. But the broad outcome is not in much doubt. The victory at the Little Bighorn did not stop U.S. expansion. It accelerated the effort to end resistance on the northern plains. And then came the final theft, carried out not with rifles on a ridge, but with ink. The Black Hills, the place that had been guaranteed to the Lakota in the Fort Laramie Treaty, the place that gold had made irresistible, were taken by the United States anyway. In 1877, Congress moved to annex them. The Lakota did not receive compensation in any meaningful sense that they recognized as just, and many refused the legitimacy of the taking at all. The message was unmistakable. If a treaty stands in the way of a mineral strike and a public demand, the treaty will be treated as a suggestion. So Little Bighorn becomes something darker than a famous battle. It becomes a hinge, a moment when native power on the northern plains showed itself in full. Lakota and Cheyenne and their allies defending their own. And the United States responded not by stepping back, but by tightening every mechanism it had built. The army, the agencies, the food supply, the disappearance of the buffalo, the law, the pen. Afterward, autonomy did not collapse in a single day. It narrowed. It shrank from open country to ration lines, from free movement to permission slips, from sacred hills to fenced boundaries. The victory was real. The cost of it was that it proved, to the people who held the larger force, that the only acceptable outcome was not containment, but control. And then, the story was taken away from the people who had lived it. There was no American eyewitness on Custer's ridges. The men who could have described exactly how his companies fell were dead. Into that silence, the country poured what it needed. Reporters needed a narrative that could be printed in a day. Politicians needed a narrative that could justify the next appropriation. The Army needed a narrative that could preserve its dignity. And a grieving public in the centennial year wanted something that sounded like meaning, not like mistake. So Little Bighorn became a legend centered on one man, a last stand, a circle of bluecoats, a heroic end against impossible odds. In that version, the battle is a tragedy with a clean edge. It begins on the bluffs and ends on the hill, and the rest of the story, the treaty, the gold, the ultimatum, the invasion of protected land, falls out of frame, and a lot fell out of frame. The Fort Laramie Treaty became a footnote instead of the foundation. The Black Hills became scenery instead of the core motive. The fact that the village was there because people were trying to live beyond agency control. With the buffalo already failing, and the pressure already tightening, became an inconvenient complication. The native side was flattened into a single word, Sioux, as if it had been one unit, one plan, one command. The reality was a coalition, Lakota bands with different leaders and histories, Northern Cheyenne groups with their own councils and obligations, some Arapaho among them too. And on the U.S. side, there were Crow and Arikara scouts riding with the Army, not as props, but as peoples making their own hard calculations in a shrinking world. Even Sitting Bull was turned into something he was not. In the legend, he becomes the battlefield mastermind who defeats Custer with a single plan. In the record, he stands more clearly as what he was. A major hunkpapa, spiritual and political leader. A man whose influence helped keep people together and helped them refuse the narrowing future that was being offered. The fight itself was decided in motion by many leaders and many small choices made fast. By riders who knew the ground and understood that the village could not afford to break. For a long time, Americans preferred the simpler story. It was easier to mourn a fallen officer than to admit what the battle revealed about expansion. It was easier to talk about bravery than to talk about land. A myth can be a kind of shelter. It keeps the weather off the conscience, but myths do not last unchanged. They get tested. Later historians went back to the paper trail, treaties, Army correspondence, agency reports, the economic logic of the gold rush. Native voices, preserved in family memory, and in interviews recorded when it was finally considered worth asking, complicated the old narrative. And the ground itself spoke, archaeology on the battlefield, cartridge cases, bullet paths, scattered positions. Did not show a single tight circle of men dying to the last in one dramatic tableau. It suggested a running, broken fight, units separating, trying to hold, trying to move, collapsing in pieces the way human beings often do when plans fail and pressure is total. Public history began to change too. The names on the land started to reflect more than one memory. The battle was no longer told only as Custer's ending, but as a defense of homes, and as a moment in a longer war over sovereignty, because that is what Little Bighorn was, not an isolated tragedy, a revealing moment, a place where the treaty system showed what it was worth when it met gold, a place where native coalition warfare showed its strength. and where the United States, rather than accept limits, chose to tighten control until the open life of the northern plains could not be lived in the old way. And that is why it still matters. Not because it is a neat story, but because it is not. It forces a question Americans keep returning to, whether we say it out loud or not. When the nation wanted land and a treaty stood in the way, what did the nation do? If you found this documentary worth your time, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more people find the series. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from?